So, hello everyone. This is about the founding family you've never heard of, the Black Tuckers of Hampton, Virginia. And this is by Rick Hampson and Deborah Barfield Berry out of USA Today. And so this is an interesting story. It's lengthy, so I have to forewarn you, but it's very interesting because it coincides with the 400th year that the slaves set foot in Virginia. So Hampton, Virginia, as Walter Jones walks his family's ancient cemetery, shovel in hand, he wonders about those who rested there. So there's a cemetery in Virginia that is called the Tuckers Cemetery. So the gravestones date back as far as the 1800s, and some bear the names of folks like Walter that he knew. Some have faded in illegibility, so some are in pieces. And so under the brush, he cleared away the ground as he's leveled. There are burial sites that are unmarked by any stone. And so apparently these are grave sites of slaves or people who were brought here to the Americas. And so the cemetery means so much to Walter because his extended family, the Tuckers of Tidewater, Virginia, believe that they are as much an American founding family as any from the Mayflower. And so they have a widely recognized but possibly unprovable claim that they are direct descendants of the first identified African American people born on the mainland of English America, an infant baptized William around 1624. So it's been 400 years that this August since William's parents arrived to Virginia colony. So the Tuckers, like many African Americans, struggle to trace their roots, and there have been no genealogical or DNA evidence linking them to those first Americans or first African Americans, but they have an oral history and family lore. And so they have a cemetery of repository of what unites them and what baffles them. So this graveyard, Walter says, is the only thing that you can actually put your hands on and put your eyes on. So he's thinking of that July, day 2 years ago, he was leveling the earth and the blade of his shovel had hit something solid. He looked down a round gray object, something to have emerged from the dirt, and he dug it under. It was a little and he lifted it up, and then he looked at the sections of it. It looked like a bowl. And so he moved the dirt a little more and spotted something else round and gray as well. He had brushed it off, all the dirt, and then he held it against the first object, and they seemed to fit. So he didn't realize it at first, but he was holding a human skull. So the researchers would conclude it belonged to an African American woman who died at age 60, roughly Walter's age, but they couldn't say when. So that night the woman was all Walter could think about, and she had embodied every question, every possibility about his family's origin, and he held her in his bare hands. So here's like a clip where you can see the cemetery. It says 1619, the Tuckers Cemetery. And so the 20s and odd, the 20 and odd. So the Tuckers want to know their story because our story helps define us, especially those that explain where we came from. So many Americans can find out who they are by Nordurster, Lloyd Line Manifest, and Ellis Island Log, or Parish Registry in Cork, Palermo, and Cornwall. For African Americans, it's not that easy. So their stories often is not what it's been stripped from them. And so this is a story about a family search for its story. And so it's about a storyteller who loved the story maybe too much, and the searchers following in her path, and the mysterious old cemetery that some feel holds a key. So the Tuckers believe that their American story started in 1619, according to the letter by the tobacco planter John Rolfe. And so the widower of Pocahontas, a ship landed in England, a 12 years old Jamestown settlement, and brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor and Cape merchant brought for victuals and provisions. So 20 and odd already had been through hell. And so they were taken as prisoners of war in what is now called Angola by African mercenaries working with the Portuguese march to the Atlantic coast, where they were branded, penned, forcibly baptized, and finally chained and head to toe deck on a Spanish slave ship headed for Mexico and a life of slavery. So San Juan Bautista carried out 350 enslaved people, more than a third of whom died on the crossing to get there. So the Gulf of Mexico, the ship was attacked by 2 English privateers, pirates, under a foreign flag of convenience. And so the 2 ships carried about 60 of the Africans north towards Virginia. And so you can see its pictorial version of it here, how it would have looked. And so Virginia had no law to permit or ban slavery, but the Africans became slaves in fact, and if not law, 1624, 2 of them, identified as Anthony and Isabella, were listed in the household of Captain William Tucker, a military commander and a settler. And so the following year, the 2 appeared in the census, this time along with William, their baptized child, a child baptized. Another African child, unnamed, also appeared for the first time in the same as 1625 census, but William is the first identified by name. So the Tuckers believe that he is their founding father, and that William was surnamed Tucker after Captain Tucker, and that their ancestors lived on near Bluebird Gap Farm, site where Captain Tucker's plantation was or is, and in what is today is called the city of Hampton. And so, but the Tuckers have so far been unable to prove their claims to the satisfaction of most historians and genealogists. So an African ancestry DNA test for a family elder, Floyd Tucker, showed that his DNA coincided with the found in what they found in the tribe in what is today called Ghana and not Angola. So from where William's parents came. So slavery, explosion, growth, and charts. That's a related article. It says how 20 and odd became millions. And so that's in your leisure. If you want to expand on this article, you can find out the growth of more slaves in this whole thing, but in this article. So it's unclear how William's line goes forward and how far the Tuckers goes back. So a professional historian hired by the family has yet to find anything to narrow the gap. So the one problem in the England's American colonists kept poor records. Settlers were more concerned about making it through the winter or fighting Indians. Often what records they kept subsequently were destroyed, and by everything from fire to worms. So today, experts say that any family, white or black, it's hard pressed to establish genealogical connections before 1800s unless their ancestors were rich, famous, or criminals. Just because the Tuckers can document their connection doesn't mean that they don't have one, said Beth Austin of the Hampton History Museums, but it's really still just a theory. That's all we can go on. So did William survive infancy in the precious colony? Did he have children? Did his family or his children have children? And so regardless, he was a symbolic beginning of so much in American life. And so of the hands that picked the cotton to the finance, the Industrial Revolution of jazz and gospel and hip-hop that took place. So Ellison and Baldwin and Morrison and the King and Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer and the Afro, the High Five, the Dunk Shot, And yet, after he was baptized on a date and in a place unknown, history's first identified African Americans simply vanished. So, an American griot, none of the Tuckers loved the story like Thelma Williams. So, as a child, she didn't listen for hours to her grandmother, who had been born sometime in the last quarter of the 19th century. So, the old woman told of family recipes and remedies and about slave uprisings and Indian wars. But while other children played or did their chores, Thelma listened, rapped. Okay, so she listened. So as a child, she did listen. She listened for hours to her grandmother talking about these stories. So all of these stories her grandmother told her, there was one she had remembered. So we were the first slave ship to come to America, and we were descended from the first black child born here. The girl was skeptical, and how do you know that, grandmother? In 1998 interview with the Associated Press, she recalled the answer, don't you know that if you take a dog down the street, he'll find his way home? Well, child, we're human beings and we're much more intelligent than animals. So we need to know where we came from. And if we put our minds to it, we always find our way home. So here's a picture of a family right here. And it looked like they're enjoying a birthday party, or it could be an anniversary. So we'll find out. But although the idea of the Tuckers went back to the first Africans in America had circulated the family for years, so it was slowly dying until Thelma grew up and got her hands on it. And so she spent days in the courthouses and libraries across eastern Virginia checking birth records and deeds, and she tracked down family elders, usually leaving the visit with a photograph or two. So she went to Richmond, and she went to Washington, and she filled a spare bedroom for her small house in Hampton with her research, including stacks of handwritten notes. Help us record Black history and American history. Our family stories often define us, especially stories that explain where we came from, yet these stories were often stripped from African Americans. We want you to share your stories as part of the 1619 Voices Project. Call this number, 202-524-0992. Tell us, what is the oral history that has been passed down in your family? And so, outside of that, her grandmother, going on with this story, was proving true. And so there had been a child, the first African, who had lived in the household of a white man named Tucker. And Tucker had a plantation near what is today the public park in the Hampton called Blueberry Gap Farm. And once, when an elderly Tucker was brought by his children to the farm, he blurted out, "This was our home." Thelma came to understand that she and AP Associated Press the importance of the Tuckers connection to the first African child. It's important for people that people know we didn't just fall out of the sky. So Thelma recorded this and all sorts of other family stories. So that Captain Tucker had William baptized, stood as his godfather, gave him a surname, and that William eventually obtained his freedom, indentured servitude, not slavery. Married possibly to a woman of mixed race, and moved to New Kent County, where he had then had children and owned land. Okay, so this is another family that's more than likely part of the Tucker group of Tucker family. So the younger Tuckers began to pay attention, especially to Thelma's cousin Wanda. Wanda remembers the older woman's excitement. "You won't believe what I just found." So Thelma's children sometimes resented their mother's obsession. Her husband accused her of living in the past, and she'd find a way to turn any conversation around to the family history and genealogy. So she'd accost acquaintances at the grocery store to fill them in on what she had discovered. So when she learned your last name, she'd tell you what plantation your people lived on. And so one of her daughters laughs at the memory. Nobody liked it. And so, undaunted, Thelma handed out a synopsis of the Tucker story at the family reunions. And so she spoke to the community groups and anyone else who'd listen, including the mailman. So her efforts were responsible. In 1994, the family officially recognized in the Jamestown Settlement History Park's reenactment of the 375th anniversary of the Africans' arrival. So the replica of this first ship, White Lion, sailed up the James River, and some of the Tuckers in period dress were on board, honored as founding Americans, and Thelma stood on the riverbank in a purple dashiki, beaming. And so the event cemented the Tuckers' status as the first family, and so the Virginia pilot of Norfolk described the Tuckers flatly as the descendants of the first Africans born in North America. So the Tuckers became the face of 1619. A group photo was taken, and you're going to see more of the photos of this family. And so it was featured in the National Park Service brochure for the visitors up to spot where the first Africans had landed. But Thelma was a paradox, and she loved the Tucker story so much that she coveted it. And because she coveted it, she tried to protect it. And so you can see pictures of the family. And so she'd only tell relatives parts of the story, never the whole thing. And she would tell them parts of the story. So Thelma believed that the story was a book, and that she was the only one that could write it. And so she compiled a manuscript, which never got published because she wouldn't relinquish control. And so she died in 1964 in 2006, and her research went to her daughters and became caught up in a family rift over real estate, divorces, and other issues. So Thelma's daughter, Sheree Green, says that her mother's research could shed light on the family tree. And so she says that she and her sister want to publish it, but they're not ready. And so the only Tuckers say that they're mystified. So the other Tuckers say that they're mystified. And so this June, Wanda stood by Thelma's simple horizontal headstone in the family cemetery, and she lamented at what the loss of the research meant to the family. So it's like she took it with her to her grave. So who lies below? So they couldn't afford the gravestone, so sometimes a mark of a burial spot, the slaves would plant a tree or plant a seed. And so the seed would become a tree, and then the tree would grow 2 feet a year. And so the place where Thelma was laid to rest is dotted with oaks and pines 50 feet high, and it almost certainly dates to the time of slavery. So it feels like a nave of cathedral. And so the Tucker family cemetery lies 7 miles from where the first Africans landed in 1619 and a mile from the site of Captain Tucker's plantation. It's incongruously surrounded by the squat of 1950s track houses and almost invisible from the street. And so by 1896, the year of Springport, Plessy versus Ferguson ratified a separate but equal. Thomas Tucker and 5 other men paid $100 for what was now the old colored burial ground. Tuckers probably were buried there before that, and they have been buried there ever since. And so but after Thelma's death, the cemetery was neglected. Neighbors used it as dumping grounds for couches, refrigerators, water heaters, and such. Snakes crawled through the vines, and the vines crawled up the tree trunks, and kids used it to play jungle. And so then on May 17, 2013, the Tuckers picked up the local newspaper, the Daily Press, and saw the headlines, "Historic Cemetery Draws Mayor's Eye." So the city officials said that it had languished for years under iffy ownership and infrequent maintenance, and so the mayor said that the graveyard apparently had been abandoned. And so the story shocked and embarrassed Wanda, Walter, and the relatives. They told the city cemetery wasn't abandoned, it was theirs, and that they in 1896 had an 1896 deed for it. And so they galvanized from the William Tucker 1624 Society and began meeting regularly to clean and prune it. And so the skull of Walter that Walter found, which was solemnly reburied in a small white coffin, was a sign that the cemetery was more than it seemed. So as the weeds and vines were cut back and the Tuckers found depressions that looked like unmarked graves, they hired a company to survey the graveyard with the ground penetrating radar. Okay, so you can see here where they're doing a lot of cleaning, leaves and whatnot. And so the result amazed them. So the cemetery contained more than 100 unmarked graves, as many as a number of marked ones. And so that's when it hit Walter that this would be where the earliest ancestors were buried. So the discovery spread the cemetery fame and seemed to bolster Tucker's claim to the history. So the Tucker 1624 Society received $100,000 in grant to environmental nonprofit for cemetery work. So the legislature approved the easement to protect the cemetery from development and ensure that public access. Governor Ralph Northam visited the cemetery last August to sign the legislation. Cemeteries can now be a way for us to retrace history, he said. So news reports often speculated that sometimes stated as facts that William eventually was buried there, and Northam himself referred to William Tucker's presence there. So today, the family is divided on whether to explore the cemetery's secrets. Walter and Wanda are willing to have graves open and remains exhumed to discover who was buried and when. And Walter believes that since the cemetery was used by a relatively limited number of families, there might have been burials as infrequently as once every few years. And so if so, he reasons that its first burials might have occurred in the 1700s, even in the 1600s, as far back as that. So William's times. But Tucker's elders think that the dead should be left in peace. For now, Walter coincides that they have a veto, but someday I'll be the elder. So a different kind of search. The Tuckers claim demands more research on historians say that historians are saying. So it's Austin and Hampton Museum's historian sums up the Tuckers dilemma. We just don't always have the information to tell the story that we want to tell. And so their story faces a competing, if less publicized, claim to a 1619 connection. A retired corporate executive named Shelton Tucker, also a Tidewater, Virginia resident, but not directly related to Wanda's family, also says that he's descended from the Williams person. So there are tensions between the Tuckers clan, Hatfields McCoy kind of thing, says the local historian Calvin Pearson. So Shelton Tucker resents the public focus on the other Tuckers claim. So the red carpet family, he calls them, were all Tuckers, but when the cameras showed up, it's always them, and they'll say anything to get in front of the camera. So there's some fighting going on over this whole issue, a debacle. So continuing the conversation. So until someone proves otherwise, the Tuckers continue to celebrate their status as the first family, and they've made the search a family affair. And so Walter's sister, Carolita Jones Cope, 60 years of age, handles calls and the media, which have been pouring in consistently. And so she's planned a ceremony Friday at the family cemetery. Vincent Tucker, who's 57, leads 1624 Society. Brandy Davis Melvin, 42 years of age, brings her 3 young daughters to the cemetery to spruce things up. And so Brenda Tucker Doswell, 77 years, speaks and sings at programs celebrating her family's story. She picked out a long skirt made of African fabric to wear when she sings Friday at the cemetery. This is the 40th years, 400 years, she said. That's what we are commemorating and celebrating. So Veradal Tucker personifies the family's pride in its story, and he knows newspapers, clippings, and customers at his men's clothing shop. So he screened a video and TV news report about the family's lineage at his church, and sometimes he changes out of his dress clothes and closes his shop and leaves a sign, "Gone to the cemetery." So an inconvenient truth. So Wanda Tucker has taken on what may be the most challenging task. And so the search for historical validation. So that's a very challenging task on this whole front issue. So for hours last month, she turned the pages of a huge ledger, squinting in the fluorescent glare at a faded cursive script, puzzling over the archaic spellings. At 61, she practiced research, PhD, professor, department chair. But this is the search of her life, and so her family can trace its roots no further than the early 1800s. Before that, the trail goes cold, leaving a 175-year gap in the genealogical chain to William, and so which is why she was pouring through the 166-year-old registrar of birth at the courthouse in Isles of Wright County, Virginia. So in trying to prove one story about her family, however, she has risked disproving others. And so this is people here that are celebrating. So the link of William was only one story the Tuckers told about their history. And so they also believe that in the long night of the American slavery, they, unlike vast majority of blacks, remained free. And so the last month, she was searching for the birth records of Thomas Tucker, her great-great-grandfather, who she thought was born about 5 years before the Civil War, and she wanted a specific date. So the record started at 1853. So she began there, scouring the ledger for Thomas Tucker, born to a woman named Millie. But there were none, not even any Thomases. And so she started over, looking simply to the Tom born to Millie. And so suddenly, after 2 hours of searching, there he was on page 21, October 20th, 1856. So she found that, but then her eye drifted across the page. She added another leaf to the family tree. So her eye drifted across the page, and after the columns with the newborn names, birth dates, mothers' names, there were 3 other columns: white, colored, free, colored, slave. Okay. And Wanda saw that despite all she had been told about the column check was the last one, slave. If that story was not true, what about most important ones of all? So she had time to think about the question, and she'll still believe that William was her ancestor until somebody proves me wrong. She says, it is a story I am holding on to, and the one that I'm going to keep telling. And so that is what makes the cemetery so important to the Tucker family and other people. Whether or not the Tuckers can ever prove the connection with the Williams guy who was brought to here, it shows that they have endured slavery and the Civil War and Reconstruction, Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, Jim Crow, and separate but not equal. But we survived, she says, and we're still here. So to explore more of 1619 stories, there are more stories under here that are related. America's Original Sin, were Wanda Tucker's ancestors American first slaves, slavery, explosion, growth, augmented reality, slavery in America, Black History, 1619 project. And so this is out of USA Today. What do you think about this extraordinary story of this family who has pursued this grave site? It's called the Tucker Cemetery, First Black Family, 1619. Very interesting read. And with that being said, I'm going to end this story. Your thought, feedback. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. And this is the 400, marking the 400th year that the slaves were brought in Virginia. Thanks for listening.